Hello and welcome. I'm Debbie Goldstein, and this is a podcast from artrepdg.com. As an online art dealer, I represent artists and photographers. I write a blog and I present podcasts. I have been really excited for today's guest, Jennifer McCabe. She's the director and senior curator of the Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art in Scottsdale, Arizona. Her impressive bio states that her curatorial practices and writing explores intersectional feminisms, site response commissions, and artist interventions. Counter Landscapes, Performative Actions from the 70s to Now, presented key works made over 40 years ago, illuminating the strategies created by women artists in the 70s and 80s, employed by artists today. I mentioned this show because it was one of my favorite shows that I've seen in a really long time. It was brilliant. She also has a PhD from Arizona State University. And she is a faculty associate there, and she has 2 kids. Welcome, Jennifer.
I'm awake. Don't worry.
Yeah, it's just like, is time management a thing for you?
Time, I don't know. Yes, it's difficult, but it's fun.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your professional path. How did you get from here to there, or there to here?
Yeah. It's kind of, I wouldn't say unconventional, but maybe a less conventional path than many museum directors. I actually have an undergraduate degree in photography and really found that was my passion. Of course, I had a degree in fine art and was completely unprepared for like working in the world.
Aren't we all?
So I had like a stint in commercial photography, and I actually got my first job in digital photography. My life and career has followed kind of like some weird evolution. So like the advent of digital photography was a thing. So I didn't learn about it in school.
Right.
But one of the first jobs I applied for, they were like, "Do you know Photoshop?" And I was like, "Of course I know Photoshop." And so I just lied my way into that job. Learned it on the job. And then, when I went back and got my degree in art history, it was a year before kind of a big curatorial studies program started popping up. So it was like kind of following this strange trajectory. But so I studied photography. I spent my 20s like in the, bohemian aspirational artist way, mostly waiting tables and things like that, moving around a lot. And then I went to school to get my master's degree because I felt like I needed to get serious, and art was still really a passion for me, but I knew I didn't want to be an artist per se. And I think, part of me, I'd always loved the humanities and writing. So part of me knew that intellectual kind of pursuit needed to be something for myself. So I really wanted to go, I'd moved to the Bay Area. I really wanted to go to Berkeley because I thought, if I go to Berkeley, I can get a job. This thing that had been eluding me for decades, like a serious job. And of course I got, denied access to Berkeley with my photography degree. All my, my pedigree and my credentials didn't get me in. So I went to San Francisco State University, and it was such a wonderful thing that I couldn't have foreseen, in all of my sadness about not getting into Berkeley. I ended up with 3 professors, one of which was, her specialty was Afro-Caribbean art, specifically Afro-Cuban, and another was a feminist scholar, and another was a queer studies scholar. So I had this kind of amazing array of professors that really resonated with interests that already were, kind of lying dormant within me. So it was a really, really wonderful time. And again, I don't think I was totally prepared for a career after getting my master's in art history. But one of my professors said, you should think about working in the nonprofit sector. And so I had an internship over the summer at an institution in San Francisco, New Langton Arts, which at that time had been around for 40 or so years. Was kind of this part of a wave of organizations that started in the 70s in the United States that were artist run. Artists started them, artists sat on the board of directors, artists did the programming, and they were multidisciplinary, they were experimental. I think of the Kitchen as one longstanding similar ethos kind of institution. So, and there's still many have closed, including New Langton, but many are still around. So I just did this internship over the summer, and I got called back maybe a year later to interview for a position. And not in those kinds of orgs, there are maybe 3 to 5 people who are on the staff. So turnover is not doesn't happen very often. But I was working for an artist at the time who I was managing her studio, and she was known kind of within the community as being a difficult person, like I guess difficult, people read strong women as difficult often, right? So she was a strong, opinionated, ambitious woman. I didn't have any issues working with her, but that perception, I don't know, I just kind of remember that perception was I could handle that relationship, and the woman who ran that organization at the time had the same, perception. So the person, it was a man, he called me up and he was like, since you work for X, I think you could work for Y. You should apply for the job. And so it was a programming position, and I worked my way up through New Langton, and I feel like the story is going on too long. Then I went to the Museum of Craft and Folk Art from there. And, I was under 40, had an opportunity to run a museum as the executive director. But of course, it was, I think that I got that opportunity because the museum was they were considering closing. They were struggling financially, right? So it was like a sinking ship. And they were like, well, what do we have to lose? This young thing thinks that she can do it, so we'll pass the baton. And, plenty of people told me not to do it, that it would be a kind of career suicide. And I was like, well, I mean, what career? Like, it's not like things are going smashingly over here. So, I'm not adverse to risk. And I thought this is it presented an opportunity for me. So in my mind, the challenge for the Museum of Craft and Folk Art was, is it still relevant? I mean, it was a moment in time where, for example, the California College of, what do they call it even?
Arts and Crafts.
Arts and Crafts.
Wasn't it CCAC?
Yes, and they dropped craft from the name. And the Museum of Art and Design in New York, they used to have craft in their name. So it was this moment where people were like, we're done with craft. And at the same time, there were other phenomena happening like Etsy. So, I thought, well, we paired with Etsy for a program that we called Craft Bar. We were like, well, we're going to embrace the word craft and see where it takes us. And we're going to embrace this kind of amateur DIY,
Very cool. Yeah.
do it yourself version of craft, instead of how people had been envisioning the craft museum before, which was like, here's a collector who focuses on African masks. They have a collection of African masks, and we're going to show these beautifully made African masks. And I was like, I had endless conversations with the board, who were, 2 generations away from me at that point in time, many of whom were in their 80s, and telling them about how people didn't want to necessarily just look at objects anymore, that they wanted an experience. And this is, 15 years ago now. So they were completely unfamiliar with this concept. And It was fun. It lasted for about 5 years until I left. And when I left, they decided that they couldn't keep the museum open. So they ended up closing the museum. But it was a blast. We worked with contemporary artists who were interested in materials. We positioned folk art as a kind of social practice. And we had wildly popular exhibitions and events. So for me, it was like, it does still resonate, the idea of craft and folk art in this day. It's all about kind of your approach and adapting to changing times, which I think is so important in museums.
Well, who is it now? Somebody right at this minute, I don't think it's Deitch, but somebody has the quilters from out in Georgia, Alabama. They have a show of their quilts right now, and it's just like, what else is that but craft?
Right. And even there was a colleague of mine, fellow organization in the Bay Area called Creative Growth that works with mentally disabled adults who are full-time artists. I mean, they're working in the studio every day.
Oh, wow.
And he really worked to reposition them as artists, not as, people who should be neglected or
overlooked
or categorized in some way. And, now many of those artists are in the Museum of Modern Art collection.
That's great.
So I'm a big fan of that kind of how we can reposition and relook at something.
Right. Well, do you think that your experience in sort of the not-for-profit, like at 80 Langton, whatever, sort of it gave you a better view? And I'll tell you why, because I worked at the kitchen, and it was my first job in New York. And I saw a million performances, saw everything. And then one day I went to the ballet to see it was Nureyev, and there was a proscenium march. I thought that was like radical, it's just like, oh my God, there's like a real stage, there's like a proscenium march. I don't really understand it, but I think it was because of my experience at the kitchen, where you have a wider view and you're more flexible in what you're seeing, that you have a better critical stance. I think, I think if you had come up a little bit more traditional, who knows, I think it helped to come from that point of view. Definitely.
It certainly helps. It certainly cultivated the idea of ideas of innovation and creativity, right? Because for me, I think maybe I even say it in my bio, I feel like I'm focused on artists and artist thinking. So even as a curator, it's less of me saying, here's my idea, here's my grandiose idea. And it's more of me being a facilitator, presenting artist ideas and thoughts. So as an institution, I feel like being artist driven, that definitely comes from, I like how you used 80 Langton. That's like the original New Langton Arts.
Right. Yeah. Oh, I'm showing my age. Let's talk a little bit about the museum world in general. I read just this week, when I was preparing to speak with you, there are at least 22 museum director jobs open. And at some of the really formidable institutions, Philadelphia, San Antonio, I think Philadelphia is sort of the worst in that most of their institutions are looking for directors. So what is going on, or clearly something's going on. Why do you think there are so many openings and that they can't actually fill those jobs?
I mean, I'm not going to pretend to know the answer to that, but I have a few hunches. I mean, one is just, it's that moment in time where, people have I forget what the term is that they call it, like a fatigue of work, and people during COVID are just like, I'd rather not do this anymore.
Yeah.
So I think the job of museum director is a challenging one. And I think this is a moment in time in which museums are really having to adjust quite quickly. And I used to always liken the Museum of Craft and Folk Art, like shifting the ideology of craft and folk art, I would liken it to turning a big ship. And so I think it's like, that's what's going on. Like and museums are being asked though to do like a full 180 right now. And at the same time, reflect on their own practices. So to be looking internally and to be serving the public in a whole totally different way, that a lot of people are unprepared to meet those challenges, I think.
Oh, that's interesting. Do you think that cancel culture has a lot to do with it? I mean, what happened with the Sacklers at the Metropolitan, and then the Whitney lost some of their board of trustees, and because, the artists have, started an uprising that says, we don't want your money on, supporting us. How well, it's pretty effective, but how widespread is that? And do you think that's a trend that will continue?
I think it will continue for sure. There are curators who've lost their jobs and directors who've lost their jobs in that moment. And so I think that, I think society is asking us to be accountable for what we do. I don't know, maybe more regularly, like less of the boys club, right? Like less of the, like, we can do this behind closed doors and feel okay about it. And society is like, I'm tired of the boys club. I don't know. Sure. Like, no, we have to be intentional in all areas of what we're doing publicly and internally.
Well, it was interesting. As you know, I was recently in New York, and I went to see the Modern, and I hadn't been to the Modern in a long time. And even though when I lived in New York, I had been to the Modern, a zillion times like you do. And it was really interesting to see that their collection now, or what they're showing, is completely inclusive. And it sort of shows, a lot of POC and people that you've never, women too, that you've never heard of, that are in their collection, and people doing work, in 70s and 80s and 90s that, I would never have known about, for starters.
Mm-hmm.
And second of all, to see the work, it was just breathtaking. It was really breathtaking to sort of see, oh yeah, it's like, yeah, of course there were people doing work, in Australia, or, in neighborhoods that, we had never considered or overlooked, I think. And that's really exciting, I think. And
super exciting.
I know that you are doing a lot of work that's very inclusive. How has the audience responded?
It's, like I was saying about kind of coming through different like big shifts in culture, like, the advent of digital photography, or the decline of the photography, interesting, these kinds of shifts. Like, I feel like this is kind of another one, in the sense that even when 10 years ago I was thinking about getting my PhD, and I really knew my focus, I wanted it to be in feminist studies and feminist art history. 10 years ago, I said to my professors that I was considering studying with, well, is this going to be some kind of career suicide if I study? Like, will anybody hire me if I focus on feminist studies? And I feel like in that 10 years, instead of being in fear of that anymore, now it is embraced. Like, society has come along the way and is saying yes to all these ideas that many people have been operating kind of in the background and not being as forthright about it. And now all of a sudden there's a moment where we can be empowered to say, well, I'm putting equity, diversity, and inclusion first. That's what I'm doing. And all of a sudden, if you're not doing that, you're kind of behind the time.
I think that's right. And I also think that's one of the reasons that your museum is sort of so visionary right now, is so, ahead of the curve and doing really wonderful work. I mean, truly wonderful work. But do you think that things are, maybe this is rhetorical, but do you think that things have really changed for women in admin and administration?
I mean, I think I don't know what the data would say, but I'm sure there are a ton more women in administrative fields of museums than there are men. So there is opportunity there, but I think that it feels still like an undervalued place, and maybe undervalued in the same way that teaching is undervalued. You know, how does our society, where do we place our value? And culture doesn't, at least museum culture or artistic culture doesn't necessarily seem to be at the top.
Right. Sure.
So it feels like there's access, but it's undervalued. And I think my focus right now is just on bringing more diversity to the admin side. I mean, it's still very white. So there are women in power, but I am very sensitive to how can I help mentor or bring up other women of color so that we can see more diversity in our field.
Sure. How has the academic major of academic or museum studies made a difference, or has it?
I think maybe even more than museum studies, what became really trendy in the last 20 years was curatorial programs, so studying curating per se. But I think that, I mean, ASU just started a new museum studies program, which is online. So that is a very interesting kind of dilemma, because I teach a class for ASU, which is all about museums. And there's so many students that love museums. And I'm just thinking to myself, how many jobs are there in museums? You know, can we support, can this like really wildly popular educational program, can the job market support it? I mean, maybe, since there are so many directors out of jobs. I don't know, but I think that curators think the training of a curator is to think critical. And so I love that. And I think that critical thinking is something that's not necessarily taught in schools for kids. So I welcome that.
Yeah. Yeah. Who teaches curatorial studies? Is it curators, and how did they learn?
I mean, so when I studied it in San Francisco, and I mentioned CCA, which is now California College of the Arts, had started a curatorial program. One of the founders of that program is now director of PS1 in New York. And her background was maybe a slightly more in the commercial realm of art, but definitely a strong thinker. And then one of my, I like to call my colleague, our curator at large at SMOCA, Natasha Bowie. And she was one of the founders of the CCA program as well. So she's still independent curator. So I think the good programs for sure are being taught by practitioners, not just not just academics, or there's a combination of being a practitioner and a thinker.
What ideas and projects that are near and dear to you would you like to see become reality?
Okay, so there's one. I mean, all the projects I'm working on, I hope come to fruition. But there's a really big one, which is an exhibition about feminism, and we're planning it for 2024. So that's 3 years away. And I was invited to participate in this exhibition by a curator who I greatly admire. So that was a really exciting moment for me. So Maura Riley, who curated an exhibition in 2007 at the Brooklyn Museum called Global Feminism. She's working on this show for 2024. Well, she was just working on the concept with another curator based in London called trans feminism. So this idea of, just a real intersectional view of feminism and kind of where we are now. Because clearly we still have to remind people about women's issues. And with the news this week, I mean, I'm just beside myself with the news of the week around abortion and rights of women and the people who are debating, whose rights matter most. It's just, I can't understand it. I can't understand how we're still having this conversation. So it's clearly a topic that still needs to be front and center. So anyhow, working on this exhibition called Trans Feminism with 5 curators. One is Aboriginal, based in Australia. Another is African, based in Europe. And then this London-based curator her institution in London focuses on queer and trans artists. So it's like even more than, we have to kind of continually update. It's not just promoting women, right? It's promoting and providing platforms for people who don't regularly get those platforms. So queer and trans artists. And so I'm really excited about that. We envision it to be an exhibition that starts in London and then comes to Scottsdale. And it will be amazing.
That's great. That's great. Any surprises about your job?
I mean, I think this past year or two has been totally unexpected.
Really? How so?
I mean, I'm surprised. I'll tell you one thing that is surprising is support from the government for the arts. That's been surprising. Like, really? Okay, we're gonna get a grant from the government? Like, we're not used to that. We're not used to support in that way. So that is super surprising. And then just how quickly we've had to adapt to a digital life and world, and things that we wanted to do desperately but never found the time to do, like this, like record a program and provide that content online. We're just doing it now. I'm really thankful to be in a contemporary art space at the moment, because I feel like we are about innovation and we are about being creative, and we're meant to be forward facing and forward looking all the time. So in many ways we were kind of poised and ready, like, bring us a challenge. We're going to do our best to tackle it. I think some other like encyclopedic museums must be having a much harder time to adjust. Because again, it's like that big old ship, and turning it is just like takes an enormous amount of energy and momentum.
Well, I also think the philosophy in those big old boats, they haven't really shifted all that much. And in some cases, it does feel like they're playing catch up. You know what I mean? And it's just really it's such an interesting time to be involved in the arts. Again, like when I was in New York, I was shocked. You get off the elevator at all these museums, and the place is packed. I mean, it's just packed. You can barely move. Like, I get it, they were popular shows, but it was just so thrilling to sort of say, oh yeah, people really do want this. They're really hungry for it. And so it's just like, how do you feed the beast, I guess, is what my question. But also what you said is just like, I think that there aren't a lot of museums like yours that are forward thinking. And I think that that's the beauty of your museum, is that it's big enough, small enough that turning the boat is doable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have to just also, whoever's leading the way and the support that they have, they need to be, because I see there are like history museums that do really innovative, use innovative technology and are really capturing people's attention in fun and new ways. It shouldn't be like only the contemporary spaces get to innovate.
Right.
It's like everybody needs to be innovating at this moment. So whether the staff is in place that can do it, or there's the support for it. But I mean, I think of like the British Museum and these big, kind of behemoths that they've been asked to, repatriate objects for decades and just dragging their feet. And it's like, you could do something,
right.
You could again be self-reflective, take a look inside, figure out how you can respond to what is changing in our society and in our culture, and adapt and change.
Yeah. What are the how do I ask this? Any limitations? What are the limitations that you kind of have to deal with in that sort of turning the ship, or steering the ship? What are your limitations, and were they expected or unexpected, or
we had to trim our budget. I mean, trim is a soft word. We had to cut our budgets by 25% for exhibitions. That's really significant.
Yeah.
And so was like, how do we cut our budget and still do really great work that brings people into the space? And so the way that we adapted to it was to, and I think a lot of institutions have done this, is to make for longer exhibitions. So why are we changing them out 3 times a year? There's no law that says you must every 3 months change an exhibition. So kind of rethinking some of the rhythms of the museum and the institution, and adapting to less money. How are we going to use less money but still do these ambitious projects? That's one big one. And then, I mean, other than just the normal weirdness of the time and protocols and requiring, how to implement policies while not being political and not, countering what is happening in the government. And we live in a not so liberal state, so being in the arts in that position is awkward.
It's a nice way to put it. Whoa. So can you talk more about how the pandemic affected your job in the museum?
Well, I think it's probably forcing our museum and other museums to look at how we evaluate our success. So if you evaluate your success on attendance numbers, for example, or if most of your revenue comes from attendance, then you're really having to rethink that as a marker of success. Because in our case, we have to cap our capacity. So, we can't have, we used to have openings with, I'm not even kidding, 700 people coming through the museum, and just a really tight, crowded space. Or we had an exhibition that was super popular one summer, and we would have thousands of people coming through this small 10,000 square foot museum a day. It was insane. And so to think about that now is weird. And we're limiting the capacity to 30 people per hour so that there can be some physical distance, so the staff feels safe, so people feel safe. So like the performing arts are starting to come back and require negative tests, and places like New York are more cohesive in their approach, shall we say. So like, just everywhere you go, you need to have your proof of vaccine when you enter into a space, and we're never going to be there. But we're starting to implement that for events, so we can just feel comfortable having more people in the space again.
Yeah, it was fascinating in New York that everywhere you went, you had to show not only your Vax card, but your picture ID, so that they made sure that you were not using somebody else's Vax card, which I thought was like, fine, great, I'm happy with that.
Totally.
Because then you feel really comfortable. That's why there were so many. That's why the museums were packed, because everybody sort of felt, really comfortable to go there.
Yeah.
You mentioned 3 professors at San Francisco State. Did you have other mentors along the way?
Probably my husband in many ways. Maybe not a mentor, but he was someone who was just like would give me a big push whenever I needed it. Like, you got this, you can do that, just do it, you got it. And sometimes for me personally, that's all I really need. I just need somebody to tell me, like, I'm doing it, you're doing a good job, keep going, or you got this, you can do it. So he's been really important even in my career. And then my studio, the artist that I work for, that I managed her studio, I remember her saying, when I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do with this art history degree and all these things, she said, well, what do you want to do? Well, I want to be a curator and a writer. And she's like, well, at the time I was making a business card, totally dating myself, like a business card. And she's like, why don't you just put that on your business card? Like, just say it, and then do it, present yourself as such. And so, those kind of mentors that really just gave me a boost of confidence when I needed it. Those were the most important to me, I think.
That's great. That's great. What's the best part of your job? Seeing ideas come to fruition is really exciting. And all the different aspects that need to come together into time and space to make something happen. For me, it's mostly exhibitions, but when you get support, you get funding, you get press, you get, artists making things, people coming to it, it all comes together, and it's like, okay, yeah, that was worth it. Yeah.
all the other days of the mundane and the, grant writing and, meetings and all the things, there are moments when it all coalesces and it keeps you going.
Yeah. If you, what advice would you give to somebody younger wanting to go into curatorial studies or museum studies?
Usually advice I give to people going into creative field, because it is a creative field, is, get ready to be creative on what you do and how you do it, be open. So you have to do the work. I started as an intern, and when I worked at New Langton Arts, I waited tables because I wasn't paid enough to make a living. And then, I would supplement, even working as a curator, supplement my income teaching. I taught at community college. So if you're really passionate about it, it's not easy.
Yeah.
You're going to have to work, and you're going to have to, figure out what you want to do and then how to make it happen. And there's no one path, right? I mean, it's not like you get your degree, you pay all this money, student loans to get a degree, and then you get a really great paying job and you pay your loans off and that's it. No, it doesn't work that way.
Right. I know one time I went to a lecture by somebody from Disney, and she said something that I never forgot. She said that sort of exactly what you said. She said that most people, their lives are like a stair step. It's just like you go to college, you get a job, you make money, you get a house, however it is. She says, but in the arts, it's kind of like this, it's kind of like you get to the top of the spiral and, you've done a great piece, and then you come down again, and then you have to do whatever you can to get to the top of the spiral. And I thought that is really true, because we've chosen a path that is different from most other people, and yet there are a lot of similarities to our path. It is that sort of spiral thing, which I think is so funny. I always
remember I made a list. I found it at one point. I made a list of like what I wanted to do with my life, and I listed out, like museum director, curator, writer, and this was like before I had experience doing anything. And so I found the list and I was like, oh my God, I did all the things on the list. So I really need to update my list. Sometimes it's just that simple. It's like whatever you can imagine yourself doing, you can do it. It may take time, and it may be a circuitous route to get there.
Right.
But you can do it.
Well, I know when I was recruiting for Art Center, I would go into classrooms and I would ask kids, I would say, how many of you have parents who like what they do? And nobody would raise their hands. And nobody, but the lone person that raised their hand always had a parent that was in a creative field. And they said they loved that. Yeah, my dad loves his job, whether he's a designer, car designer, graphic designer. And it was, again, no data, but that was always the case. It's like, all these kids, none of their parents enjoyed what they did except for the people in creative fields. Well,
it's interesting. I mean, I was thinking about it today, thinking nobody in my family. I mean, my mother went to college very late in life and studied in interior design, but it's still, it's a more commercial side of art. Nobody in my family really had that experience. So it makes sense in many ways that it took, like, I'm a late bloomer. It took me a long time because I didn't have somebody like leading the way. It was like by trial and error. How to get what you want and how to figure out what you can do in the art world.
Right. And also, I mean, there are limitations. When I was certainly coming up, I mean, being a girl or a woman was, not a plus. So I don't know if those obstacles have been less insurmountable. I would hope that they are right now for younger women.
It's a difficult thing. Like as I was mentioning the news this week, there was a headline in the New York Times, and it was like, oh, the lawyer in the Mississippi case is suggesting that the need for Roe versus Wade, the need for abortion, has lessened because women can better balance life and work. And I was what is that?
Yeah, what planet is he on?
What? Yes. Because I don't, in many ways, I don't think it's easier. Like I said, there may be more women and maybe the opportunities are there, but do you get paid as well as your
Right.
counterparts? I really don't believe that.
No.
I mean, I know in my case, it's like really not true.
Yeah.
And that's part of the feeling that being undervalued.
Mm-hmm. Well, even at a sort of supposedly woke place like DreamWorks, I didn't make as much as my male counterpart, you know,
So
so
frustrating.
it's so
Yeah.
frustrating. It's so frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Much work still to be done.
Right. And I know that there was a statistic sort of early on in the pandemic that said that they thought that 12,000 museums may go out of business just because of, again, like you mentioned, with attendance and then lack of funding and whatever. And it's just like, and then there was this along the way, people who had been studying art history or studying curatorial studies in museums were they, I don't want to do this. I'm not going to be able to get a job. And I think that that's really sad. It's really sad for our little sort of pocket of culture, because we need young people to be able to do that. And if they're opting for something less creative, I mean, I think that if you do what you're passionate about, you'll be happy. You'll find a way to, do what you want to do, and you'll be happy, which
make it work. Somebody asked me recently why museums, why children should go to museums, why it should be an important thing to take children to museums. And I thought, well, it's because you see multiple perspectives. You get to see the world from this vantage point and from that vantage point, and that builds empathy, and that is so critical. So I don't know. I still believe in museums. I still believe in the power of art. I believe it's important now more than ever. I mean, the world is super divisive, and so if there's something that can help bring us together, then I want to be part of that. So
yeah, I agree. That's great. I have one more question for you, and it's kind of like my actor studio question. If you could have dinner with 3 people, living or dead, who would it be and why?
Okay. This is so hard for me because, like, if you ask me what's your favorite band or what's your favorite artist, I'm like never have an answer. I hate to choose favorites. So and I don't know if this dinner party is like, this is a dinner party, or do I get to have dinner with them individually? So that's like one thing. But anyhow,
however,
whatever, right?
Yeah.
So I would want to have dinner with David Bowie, because he's just a musical genius and gender bending, creative. And he was just amazing. And that was my first concert, actually, was I got to see David Bowie. It's been like a steadfast love my whole life. And then I have a current crush on Padma Lakshmi. because she has great taste, because food is really important to me. And I loved her recent show on Netflix that looks at like what it is to be American through all these different immigrant communities.
Isn't it great? Yeah.
I'm wholeheartedly in on that. So
yeah.
And I think Padma and David Bowie somehow would be a great combo. At dinner.
Yeah.
And then the third one, I don't know. A part of me wants to say Linda Nochlin, because she's like the original feminist art historian. Sure. I don't know that she would make a good dinner guest. I'm not sure. But I think she paved the way for much of the work that I've been able to do.
Right.
And then it's kind of like this weird, like it's the intellectual side of me, but also the like sensual food side and music. So I don't know, it kind of makes sense.
Those are great. And did you ever have a chance to meet her or hear her speak?
No.
Oh yeah. No. I did. And yeah, it's you're just like in awe. And so when you just sit in the audience and part of you says, oh, I'm so glad that like I know what she's talking about, or that, I'm one of the flock that, that she's speaking to, because she just makes you feel so good about your ideas and whatever, mostly because yours match with hers, but
Right.
she was very inspirational, very inspirational. Yeah.
That why have there been no great women artists is like, it's still relevant today, 50 years later. It was written in 1971.
Right.
Because it really looked at the institutional nature of the art world, right? So like there weren't great women artists because women weren't allowed to study in the art schools.
Right.
It's kind of different than what most people think the article's about. It's like, of course there are great women artists. And it's like, well, there really aren't as many as there could be because they're held back through our institutions. And so at a moment when we're really looking at institutional racism and other things, I think it's still super relevant, that that mode of thinking. And I'm excited to say that the curator that I greatly admire, that I get to work with, Maura Riley, did that show Global Feminisms with Linda Nochlin. So it's like, one degree of separation.
But what's interesting that you bring up is that, like, I was in school when that came out, and at the time we were content to say, well, there's only been one Picasso. It's like there haven't been a million Picassos or a million Duchamps. It's just like we didn't take the argument or the premise far enough, and we were very content with that answer for a very long time, which I'm sorry to say I was, I didn't really get it. And I remember thinking, I think it was in 1974 when I was at Ohio State, that was, I'm aging myself, I get it, but that was the first year that Ohio State decided to have a dedicated women's studies major. And I don't know that, and they've got rid of it, like I think about 5 years ago.
No, it's not. It's not over yet. Sorry.
It's not over.
It's like a practice. It's like a garden. It's like you have to continually be, putting women's issues at the forefront. Otherwise, they're gonna get way back here.
Right.
So it's something that we just have to keep doing it.
Well, I also think that there's a part of it where certainly in 1974, people would like pat you on the head and say, oh, isn't that cute? You're majoring in women's studies. Like, there was a really kind of backlash to the fact that, it wasn't deemed important, but it was important in 1974. I mean, because there were so many issues going on, and again, it just seems that like you mentioned about Mississippi, it couldn't be more critical. It couldn't be more of an issue than it is, today in 2021. I mean,
right. And even if it's not an issue in your personal life or in your region, I mean, you can think of so many places around the world where protecting and supporting women is just like critical. I mean, I kind of joke that, especially this week, things don't work out with the museum, or I'm just going to quit my museum job and start working for Planned Parenthood. Like it's so frustrating. You're like, where can I put my skills? I need to put it to there. It's clearly needed.
Exactly right. Well, I must say, I, for one, and I think I speak for many, I'm really happy that you have the museum job, because the work that you're doing is just way above. I mean, I think it's the best that Scottsdale has ever been, for sure. And I thought a lot about the museum when I was in New York, thinking that, we're right up there. We're right up there. The work
Thank
that you
you.
do is really important. And I hope you do it for a long time, quite honestly.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
so I want to thank you for spending time with me. This has just been so great. And is there anything else that you feel you want to say?
No. I mean, I'm kind of curious who you would invite to dinner, but is that?
Oh,
I mean, it's like I just answered a lot of questions, but like, what about you, Debbie? Do you ever answer that?
I can. I would
Okay.
invite Robert Oppenheimer.
Okay.
I would really invite. I would love that. I would invite Duchamp.
Ooh, that's a good one.
And I would probably go with Manet.
Nice.
That would probably be the three people that I would want to just have my mind be exploded by what they have to say. And it's an interesting question because we, especially now, we live in a moment where there are no heroes. And so, to sort of mention who you mentioned, it's like our heroes, it's like, absolutely, Padma Lakshmi is a hero. I mean, she's absolutely, and Bowie and Linda Nochlin, it's great. It's a great time to want to have heroes. Oh, who else? Sadly, I would also want is Stephen Sondheim. So very timely, but also true.
Yeah.
So, Jennifer, thank you again. This has been
my
great.
Pleasure.
I was looking forward to it for a long time. And this has been a podcast from Art Rep DG. You can find artrepdg.com. I must say, you'll be able to find the podcast on my website, on YouTube, on Spotify and Apple, and most platforms that you use to hear podcasts. Thank you for listening. I'm Debbie Goldstein, and see you next time.